So the first method you're going to learn is the stitch and flip method, which is putting two pieces right side together, stitching along a diagonal line, and then flipping that open. It's a little bit more than that, but we'll talk about it. The pattern wants you to take your center square for your star, which is piece A, and then put a piece C square next to each side, top, bottom, and both sides. And make sure that those are the right color orientation. So we have that, and then we want to do our stitch and flip corners. You can see from the pattern, this is page 8, that we have the formation just like the pattern calls for, and our points of the stars go on the corners closest to the middle of the star. So how we're going to do that is we are going to take our points and we are going to line them in the corners, one on each square, because we have to sew them, trim them, iron them, and then we will put on the second corner because it's going to overlap the first corner. Now on the back of these, you're going to mark a diagonal line corner to corner, and you want that to be as accurate as possible, going directly from one corner to the next. I'm just using a mechanical pencil. That's my method of choice because it's sharp and blunt. I never have to sharpen it. As long as your fabric isn't see-through, you're probably going to be fine. So what I'm doing is marking a diagonal line with the right sides of my fabric together. So I'm actually using a solid. It doesn't really matter, but I really do want to put the right sides of my fabric together. And I'm marking my line in the direction of the point. So if you can see that line, and I'll put my ruler there, that's the direction of the line. And if you look on the pattern, that's the direction you want the line to go for this piece, and that makes a point here. But this is the side we're actually going to be flipping open, and it's going to be the side left. So once we sew a seam along that line, we are going to be opening this up like this to reveal our point, and we will be trimming this part off. So you want to go around and mark a line on each piece B in the direction it notes in the pattern. If you're using a solid or a non-directional fabric, this is a non-directional fabric. It has little pluses on it. No matter which way you turn them, they're the same. We've talked about this before. This would be a directional fabric. If you turn it sideways, they look different, and you're going to be able to tell the difference. If we're using directional fabric, let's get a very distinctly directional fabric. If we're using this as our corner, let's shift this up and out of the way real quick. And we just toss it down right sides together. Say we want to imitate this piece right here. So we mark our diagonal line from here to here. I'm going to do this. These are the Omni Grid rulers I recommend that are skinny, and they're great for marking lines. I know that's hard to see, but I marked a diagonal line to mimic this line. After I sew this line and trim the side off, I'm left with a 1/4 inch seam allowance to the outside, to the point, to the corner of the seam line. I'm going to iron this open on top. Now see what happened there? We got a great point. It's the direction that the point is supposed to be. But the pattern is going the wrong way. We want those kitties in the quilt to be going in the vertical orientation. So like it says in the pattern, page 8, a good rule of thumb is to make sure your fabric is turned in a horizontal direction, not a vertical direction when the wrong side is facing down. This is nice because you can see the pattern from both sides. So this is how we had it, but we really want to turn it in a horizontal pattern. And depending on which side your point is on will determine if you turn it horizontal with the top on this side or horizontal with the top on this side. And that just takes a little bit of practice and getting used to. If we have our diagonal line again here, and we flipped this open, and we can see this is the correct orientation for the point, the same as this. If we're mimicking this piece, we would have the correct orientation of our kitty fabric. So that's just something you can kind of check as you're sewing and marking those lines. And in this case, how I build a block is I do them one at a time. Now the pattern says it walks you through doing the points and then the second set of points, and then it says if you're making the 16 blocks, you want 16 sets of 4 because you want 4 squares for each block that have those 2 points on each square. We have 16 stars for the cover quilt, so we want 64 squares, piece C squares with piece B points. And if, say, I lay out all of my squares into groups of blocks, which is what I've done. I've taken all my pink fabrics and I've put them together the right amount for each block with all my purple fabrics, and then I've thrown in my star middle and my star points, and I've just put them in little piles for each block. So you can do that for every block, and then you could do each block individually, or you could take all of your light blue fabrics and all of your points and sew them on. That's a little bit easier when your fabric is non-directional. Otherwise, just keep track. I prefer, like I said, to lay out a whole block at one time. So I have these boards. It's like a foam core board, and I bought flannel. Sorry, it's full of lint. I just folded it onto the back and taped it. I have small ones and big ones, and I use them to lay out blocks or hold pieces for a quilt. I have all my pieces for this quilt on a separate one. So I would take my middle square and I would start to lay out this block. It's going to overlap this block a little bit. It's not quite big enough just because I ran out of my big ones. All my big blocks, big foam blocks are holding quilts or pieces or blocks. So I'm starting to lay out my block here. As you can see, I'm actually going to start to fill in with the purple squares, because as you can see here, that you're going to alternate those purple squares with the pink squares. And like I said, I am going a little bit beyond my block, but this is just to give you a visual. And I would take this whole thing to my sewing machine and have it laid out like this. And as I'm sewing the block, I'm walking through the pattern, I'm doing the individual parts, and then I'm sewing the block together just like the pattern tells me. And then I have one full block done. You can kind of decide what works for you in terms of sewing. This sew along for Learn How to Quilt is kind of oriented so you do all your points and all your HSTs in 1 week. You do not have to do that. You could wait for next week when we are learning about how to construct a whole block and just practice sewing points this week. I have a few extras. That's funny. So these are my 4 extra points that will go on as the second points there. So I have this whole block laid out. So I kind of want to follow along in the pattern and do what the pattern tells me to by sewing all the point B's on. So we're going to go and sew these point B's on, and then we're going to trim them, flip them open and iron them, and then we'll sew on the second set of point B's on each block. And that'll show you the stitch and flip method. The most important thing to remember, if it matters to you, it does not matter to everybody, is the fabric direction like I talked about. If you don't want to, I am particular when it comes to my directional fabric, but it does add time. You have to stop and pause for all of these little instances where the fabric could be directional. The star fabric and the point fabric, ideally those would be non-directional fabrics like this plus. Technically, these little balloon guys are non-directional because on the fabric itself, the little balloon animals go every which way. Let's see what else would be non-directional. This is for my 4.5 inch quilt over here that I've been cutting. These little guys are non-directional. They do have little faces, but they're going all different directions. This would be a non-directional fabric, stars and circles. This would be a non-directional fabric. It's like a floral. This is a very non-directional print. For the stitch and flip method, we have all of our first piece B's in the right spot on our block, and we have our diagonal line going in the same direction as shown here. So we're going to go to the sewing machine and we are going to sew those piece B's. We have our block laid out on our board just right next to us to keep track of. So I am going to take from my star. So I'm going to take from my star center the block directly to the right. I'm keeping this square in the corner in the right orientation, but as I get close to sewing, I'm going to make sure it is aligned perfectly in the corners and along the edges with each other, the back square and the front square, right sides together, my diagonal marked line going in the right direction. Now, if you feel more comfortable, I have pins right here. You can pin that square perfectly in place, and that might be good to start with. Over time, you'll learn how to do it without pins, and it will save you a little bit of time. So we are going to sew on that line, and here's my tip. Because the thread and the fold of the fabric take up some space, we actually don't want to sew directly on top of that marked line. We want to sew just a hair or a thread's width to the outside of that line, which is towards the point. So we're still sewing on the line, but we're sewing just to the side of the line so we can see the line, but we want to be as close to the points as possible. We don't want to go too far over because then our points aren't going to match up in the middle. So when we're sewing these, I would not do a back stitch. That adds thickness and is not super necessary. Keeping your stitch length to around a 2. It can vary on your machine, but you want it small enough that it's not going to unravel easily, but not too small that if you have to unpick it with a seam ripper, it's uncomfortable. And you are just going to sew, like I said, on top of that line towards the outside edge of the line. It's a little bit hard to explain, but I'll show you, and hopefully we can get a visual of this after I'm done sewing. So I have a cutter on my foot for this machine, and I can cut before I even lift it up. So just know that's what's happening. So we can see here that you can see the marked line, and you can see how my seam is just to the side of the marked line. So that way, once we fold it over, it's going to fill up the whole space that this corner took up, because we want this square, once the points are done, to be the same size as it was originally, and we're going to have to trim that down a little bit. So let's take the pin out. So I'm going to sew each of these squares with our points. There's 3 more, so we're going to sew them all. And I did lose a square somewhere between here and the cutting board. But I have my sewn piece here, so I'm laying it back down on my laid out block in the right orientation of the pattern. And then I'm going to sew these other 3 squares, and then we'll go and trim off our points and iron it, and then we'll do our second set of points. So let's sit back and sew these other 3 points on, keeping them in this orientation and keeping everything aligned. This is my bottom square with my piece B corner. And you might see how I'm putting it through the machine. I turned my first piece C and piece B so that it was in the same orientation, where I am sewing just to the right of that line. That feels most natural to me, so that's how I sew. If you wanted to sew with it in this orientation, that's completely fine. just remember the outside of your line is towards the point. So I'm going to put this back into the block exactly where it belonged and grab the next piece C with piece B corner, aligning those corners. Remember, even though I have solid fabric, I am aligning with right sides together. Right sides of fabric is the side of the fabric that you want to see. So the side, if it's printed, that has the print on it. Here's my next corner. And this is the orientation. It's going back in the block. You just want to keep that in mind. And my fourth corner with the block in that orientation. And like I keep mentioning, the orientation of where these corners are to the block is because we're rotating this piece as we're sewing to have it be in the direction I want it to be when it goes through the sewing machine. So therefore, when I pull it out, I'm not going to put it back like this. I'm going to rotate it back into the direction it went into the block. So I'm going to meet you back at the cutting table because we are going to trim these corners off our piece C and piece B star points. Okay, I brought everything back over just to keep everything visually where it's supposed to go. So the pattern says to trim 1/4 inch to the outside of the sewn line. So let's take this first piece that we sewed. This is where some of your smaller rulers come nicely into play because they're a little bit easier to maneuver. You're going to align your 1/4 inch line, that's the first line from the edge, on top of your seam that you just sewed. And then you're going to just cut away that point. And that gives you a 1/4 inch width seam allowance. And it takes away that excess fabric, which you don't want in your quilt because it makes it too thick. And when we iron this point will fill in the space that used to be filled in with the fabric itself. And then we're going to do our second point over here. So I'm going to put this just trimmed back into place over here, continuing to double check my orientation. By a couple blocks, you're going to have that down pat and you're not going to have to worry about double checking all the time. But it's always good too if you're unsure, because I sewed one of these blocks completely wrong. I swapped out the purple for the blue, and it's completely wrong. So I can't use it in the quilt because I need the purples to be every other throughout the whole quilt. 1/4 inch line right on top of my seam, trim it away. Something to think about, putting it back into the square. So there's 2 other things you can do if you get comfortable. And I wouldn't do tons of these because you don't want a lot of thickness. But using the lines on your cutting mat, if you can align the seam that you're cutting a 1/4 inch away from directly on top of one of the lines on your cutting mat, you can then place a second one right next to it, aligning with the seam below and aligning on your cutting mat, making sure the side you're going to cut is facing the same side. And then you can align your 1/4 inch mark right on top of the seams, and you can cut 2 at once. So that's where you could use a bigger ruler if you did 3 or 4 going up. But you just want to make sure they're very straight and aligned very well with each other so you don't get a really scant seam allowance on one. So let's see here, putting them back where they belong. I think I got that right. The last thing is what I do. It saves a little bit of time. You can put a small cutting mat next to your sewing machine, and you could do this cutting right next to your sewing machine. So back where it belongs, we're going to go to the ironing board next, and I'm going to press
my video.
I'm going to press all of these
when
points
I
out.
ironed the first point, so I'm just popping a quick little look at ironing when I have 2 points on, and you can check that out at the end of the video.
Going to the next page of the pattern, you see we are doing the next set of piece B's. I just realized a pattern error. It'll be fixed by the time the pattern comes out. I'm not going to redo the video though, because we all make mistakes, and I want this to be cohesively for one block. So the pattern here will show you that we will be sewing on the B pieces that are next to the ones we just sewed. So you can mark them with a diagonal line. And remember, if you're checking for fabric orientation, just make sure. Fun fact, this piece, whether put here or put here, as long as it's oriented correctly, will work whichever way you fold it. And the same goes for these pieces. So that's something that if it has a directional, gives you a little bit of leeway in your fabrics. If you're marking fabrics for one block, you have 8 piece Bs. You could mark half, a quarter of them, so 2 of them going one way, 2 going the other way, and then keep rotating, and you should have directional pieces that will work for any spot. Again, totally fine if you don't care about directional fabric, or you don't want to worry about it yet, or bonus if you get non-directional fabric. I have all the next set of piece Bs right sides together with our first set of piece Bs and piece Cs. We are going to go sew along the mark lines, the same thing we did for the first set, and then trim and iron. And then we'll trim these blocks individually to make sure that they are perfectly square, or as close to square as we can get. Yeah, let's go back to the sewing machine. I wish I could get my camera angle to show you a little bit more, but I feel like if I show you more of the black, I show you less of the sewing. So I am grabbing my first piece and aligning, making sure those corners are perfectly aligned. And then this piece goes along the edges of the piece underneath. And I am sewing again. Slightly to the outside of that. And there we go. But this black actually goes like this. So let's put that back and grab the next one. Now you can see this is how the black goes on there. It's the bottom piece C, the bottom with star points, but I'm rotating it so that I can put it through the machine the same as I've done the rest. And so you just have to remember that. That's why I like to do block by block personally. Again, sewed so we can flip it. Grabbing the next one. This takes very little rotation. Making sure those points are aligned. Grabbing my last piece C with piece B point and aligning the corners. And again, if you decided you wanted to use pins and you laid this out at your cutting board and you pinned them all there, you can just whip them through the sewing machine. Okay. Okay, we have each square with the piece B points, the second piece B point sewn on. So we're going to go trim these, and then we're going to iron them, and then we'll trim these squares to make sure they are the perfect square. Okay, we brought over our pieces, and we're going to do our trimming again. I'm going to show you how I trim with the scissors. This is where very sharp, good scissors like the Kai scissors come in. Just eyeballing 1/4 inch, and technically you could mark a little line so you could know, but just eyeballing, you can just cut all the way across with one swoop. I do that a lot for small pieces. This is potentially the largest piece I would do that for because I can get a nice accurate cut. If it's longer, I'm going to have to move my scissors again and it might not be as accurate. So it's just something to consider. The last thing to consider if you're doing that is to make sure that your fabric isn't see-through, because with lighter fabrics or thinner fabric sometimes you can see the seam allowance shadow through your fabric, and you want that shadow of that seam allowance to be very nice and crisp. Now this is a good time because next week we will be sewing together the whole block. So I can see here a few squares that aren't perfectly flat. That happens if I don't get a good iron before I trim, or just if they get wrinkled in the process. So a great time to just kind of iron out a few things so it's easier to sew. So let's go back to the cutting table and double check that these are the right size and trim off any fabric that we might need to trim off. Okay, our last thing on our pattern is to trim these piece B corners to make sure this is the correct size. This is a great time for a rotating cutting board to come in handy. Okay, so I hope mine is working okay. It's a little bit bowed, but it's basically supposed to spin, so you can put a block on it and turn the block around. Two ways to do this. You can put it, would be the ideal situation, a rotating mat with a ruler, the exact size for what you need. Then you can align that ruler directly on top of the block. So I'm aligning it with the 2 points opposite the points we sewed on, the 2 points of the PC square, and I'm trimming off along those points that we sewed on any of these edges to make sure that that block is perfectly square. See, it's just a sliver. It's not much, but it just gives enough to make sure as we're sewing, this is the exact same size as all the other squares. So I guess you probably need the rotating mat less if you have a square that is the same size as your square you're trying to trim to. So let's try that without the rotating mat. Again, putting the square on top, aligning it with the 2 PC square points, and then the piece B points are what we're cutting off. Sometimes you won't cut off any. Okay. If you don't have a ruler that's the exact same size as your square you need, you can use any ruler. A smaller one is definitely easier to maneuver. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to cut 2 sides at a time, and then I'll cut the third side separately. So I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to measure from these points. I'm going to measure at the 3.5 inch mark here because it's a 3.5 inch square. I'm going to put the other point in the 3.5 going this way. And then that line that goes up from there, I'm going to align in this line. Mainly my points and the bottom edge and the pink is what I want to align. The yellow is potentially going to stick out. And then I'm going to trim off the 2 sides. I can't access this third side yet. Then to access that third side, I'm going to rotate it. And I'm just going to, this is the side I need to trim still, measure again, 3.5, 3.5, 3.5. And I have a little bit to trim off there. A good way to do that again is like we did in the cutting of the fussy cuts. We put washi tape, and you could put washi tape on the 3.5 inch markings. I realized last time where my error was, and it would be ideal to put it on the 3.5 inch markings on the back. So that way, when it's up against your fabric, it's very easy to see, whoops, where your 3.5 inches was. Because my tape was on top and this ruler has a thickness, I was kind of struggling with seeing where my marks were. So this is a little bit easier, putting my tape right on the back, and then I can do that last side. And bonus, I cut my tape a little bit. So that's how you would do this using ruler that's larger than what the size square you're trimming to is. So again, I am going to align the 3.5 inch point, 3.5 inch point, and cut the two sides that are showing, and then rotate it to do, oops, I got a little piece of tape stuck on me, to do this last side. Now, like I said, sometimes you might not cut off any. Sometimes your corner might actually be slightly askew. Say when after we trimmed it down, our yellow was kind of a little bit off. That's okay, as long as it's less than 1/8 of an inch. You can play with that in sewing together of the black. And we'll talk about that next week when I have you sew this whole block together. So that is how you do a stitch and flip corner. Very simple. The keys that I find to doing a stitch and flip corner so that it fills this whole section left by trimming off your square is sewing just to the side of that marked line. That really helps with the little extra bit of fabric taken up by the fold and the thickness of the thread, and gives you really nice perfect squares here. What you can do this week to do all the star points is you could start like this, laying out your blocks individually, and do all the star points, and then just stack your block up. Again, this is how I stack my block up. I put the rows starting at the top going down, and you could label these row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You could go ahead and sew these together and not wait for the next week. Totally fine too. You could say, you know, this block is going here, so you could write block 4, right? Block 4, row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You could even stack it like this, because you know this is the top of the block, and you know how the block is oriented based on the picture. So totally fine. If you want to set it aside, if you want to do all of your points for this quilt this week, or if you want to wait after you've learned how to sew together the actual block, now that you know the stitch and flip method, I thought I would do a quick overhead look at sewing a block together. I am going to speed through the block. This is just another example of sewing. I'm going to show you one trick here. I was marking my lines, but with squares so small, a lot of times I will just fold them in half to make a crease to follow. The only part of that is that the crease is on the bias, so it could stretch, so you just have to be very careful as you are pressing that crease, not to push, but to lift and move your fingers so that you're not skewing that fabric at all. I have a block laid out here. This is the top and the bottom, and it is the other block style in the pattern with the light blue and then the dark blue and then a little bit of purple on the corners. Of course, if you subbed in different colors for this, because this fabric, the point fabric for piece B is solid, and these pretty much you can turn either way. We don't have to be as careful, but I still like to kind of follow the pattern of one point on each, kind of on the same location. And I'm gonna line my corners, sew my line, and go from there. I will probably speed this video up a little bit, but I'm also going to chain piece. So I know that I always start here, and I'm not going to cut my thread after this. I'm going to put my square piece B in the proper corner, and I'm just going to continue sewing only with a few stitches in between each square. And then I know once I get to the end that because I started with this piece always, that's always my first piece on my chain. Now I'm cutting, and I have to clip them apart. They're attached by a few stitches, and I'm just kind of piling them up in the order from last on the bottom, which is the top, to first, and then I'm going to pop them back into their spot so I can kind of keep track that way. And then I'm going to trim. I actually brought my trim, my cutting board over here, a smaller one, so you guys could watch that process. Just trimming directly at here, and then going right into the ironing. I don't know if you can see the iron, but I'll pop my wool mat up here. I have a wool mat that I iron on, and I can just iron it right here. I have a little movable ironing cart that I keep next to my machine. Okay, you can see that I have each piece C with one piece B point in the proper location. And then I'm going to continue on to do my second. I did mark the lines on these, so just remember that marked line goes facing up, so it's what you're going to sew on, or just to the side of. And again, I am chain piecing, so as I put them through my machine, I'm kind of alternating which side my point points to, so that they kind of nest a little bit easier in the chain piecing. You don't have to chain piece at all. And then I'm just clipping them apart. That was my last one, so the top, and then back in the same order, and placing them back in the same order on the board and trimming down. At this point, when I trim off that corner, I'm also going to actually trim the whole block down to size at the same time and put it right back where it belongs in the block, just so it's all done in one fell swoop. So there I have all of my point squares made for one block, and I could sew this together, which we will cover next week.